Behind every great legend in history stands an exceptional story. This is the case for John Luther Casey Jones. Casey was born March 4, 1863, to Frank and Ann Nolan Jones in an area near Casey, Kentucky. It is widely thought that this is where he got his nickname Casey from. At the tender age of 15, Jones went to work for the Mobile and Ohio Railroad as a telegrapher. He was then transferred in the company to the Columbus, Kentucky to Jackson, Tennessee route, where he was hired as a flagman and then promoted to brakeman. Through his demanding work, Jones was again promoted to serve as fireman and worked on the Mobile, Alabama route. Because of this promotion, Jones moved to Jackson, Tennessee. While staying at the boarding house in Jackson, Casey met and married Mary Joanna Janie Bradley. Because she was Catholic, he decided to convert to the faith and was baptized on November 11, 1886, at the St. Regis Catholic Church in Whistler, Alabama. They were then married on November 25, 1886, at St. Mary's Catholic Church in Jackson, Tennessee. He was a teetotaler and never drank alcohol, and was a devoted, family-oriented person. Casey saved his money, and with his earnings, they bought a house in Jackson, Tennessee, and settled down in married life. Together, Casey and Janie had 3 children, Charles Jones, Helen Jones McKenzie, and John Lloyd Jones. Now, having a family to support and seeing great opportunities for advancement in the career that he loved, Jones began moving up in the railroad system. During the summer of 1887, there was a sudden outbreak of the yellow fever in the Mississippi River Valley. The mosquito-borne illness is unwittingly carried by individuals who worked for the railroad system. While many became extremely ill or died, the epidemic left a demand for workers on the railroad routes, an open path for quick advancement in the companies. A demand for a fireman in the Illinois Central Railroad, or the IC, came open, and Jones leaped for the chance for advancement. On March 1, 1888, Jones on the Jackson and Water Valley route became a fireman on the freight locomotive. Jones achieved one of his goals when on February 23, 1881, he was recognized for his talent and he was promoted to engineer. He became well known as the best engineer in the business. On March 10, 1881, Casey's name appears on the register of books for the Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers. It was said that Jones was so punctual that you could set your watch by him. He was never behind schedule and always arrived at the destinations on time. Casey Jones worked in Jackson, Tennessee, with the freight service line between Jackson, Tennessee and Water Valley, Mississippi. Both locations were always busy and had especially important stops along the route for the IC Company. Jones had developed close relationships with workers along the route between 1890 and 1900. Having the reputation for making all his stops on time came with risks. 9 citations issued by the Illinois Central Railroad gave Jones a total of 145 days, about 5 months of suspension. It was well known at the time that unofficially the rules for being late were far harsher than the ones for breaking the rules for being too speedy. However, Jones did not have a rule infraction the last year of his life. Casey Jones' train had a whistle that was made of 6 thin tubes bound together. The shortest tube was half the length of the longest tube. Jones was very well known in the area for his trademark way that he blew the whistle to make it sound like the bird call of a whippoorwill. The whistle, as it is described, it started off with a long-drawn, soft whistle that grew in sound. After it peaked, it would die off into a whisper. Jones loved baseball and watched or participated in the game whenever his schedule would allow it. He had played during the 1800s at Columbus, Kentucky, while he worked at the Mobile and Ohio Railroad as a club operator. The Water Valley Shop team was due to play baseball one Sunday in 1898, and Jones got to haul the team to Jackson for the game. The summer of 1893, the World's Columbian Exposition had come to Chicago, Illinois. This was attracting huge crowds to Chicago on the lake side of the grounds, which was I.C. Railroad's territory, and was quickly overwhelming the trains. A call went out in the company for engineers to come and help with the load of transporting thousands of passengers. Casey volunteered to go. He then ran the suburban service from Van Buren Street to Jackson Park that summer. Illinois Central had their new train on display at the fair. Hailed as having the latest and greatest of all the technological advancements in trains, the 638 boasted an 8 drive wheels and 2 pilot wheels. It was a 280 consolidation type. The 638 was due to go into service in the Jackson, Tennessee area after the fair had closed. Jones had asked permission for the new train to be sent to the Water Valley and to drive the train to its new destination. The request was approved. The number 638 ran its first 539 miles with Casey Jones at the helm. Jones was able to work on the 638 until late into the 1890s. Casey was able to do extra work on the passenger runs and was offered much shorter working days with better pay and considerable prestige. And as a bonus, the passenger train runs helped him stay closer to his family. John Wesley McKinney was a good friend of Casey's, and the two men worked together exclusively until Jones transferred to the Memphis line in 1890. Casey Jones was a hero before the fatal accident in which he saved many lives. His hero status would go on to live in a television series as well as an animated short by Disney. We will look at the actual event that had him spoofed in the short and the television series itself. Then we will cover the last transfer in his career. During one of his routes in 1895 toward Michigan City, Mississippi, Jones had turned over the engineering duties to another engineer, Bob Stevenson. After reducing the train speed, Jones went out to the running boards of the train to oil the relief valves to adjust the steam screen. This was routine maintenance that all engineers, firemen, and brakemen did to keep the engines running. After completing this task, Jones returned to the cab of the train. Immediately, he noticed a group of children on the tracks some 60 yards ahead. Noticing the oncoming train, most of the children stopped playing and left the tracks, except for one little girl who was frozen in fear. Jones yelled to Stevenson to reverse the engine. Jones leaped into action. Climbing out into the cowcatcher, Jones was able to scoop up the little girl. When the train had stopped, he returned her safely to the ground. This event has been spoofed in the movie The Brave Engineer, where the hero saves the damsel in distress from the bandit. This incident alone could have placed him in the hero status and immortalized his name forever. It would be another train trip that would cement him in history as the hero that he was. This account can be found by Fred J. Lee in his book Casey Jones, Epic of the American Railroad, 1839. There are many of us who remember the Casey Jones cartoons, with him both as a train engineer and a baseball player. Walt Disney did a short in 1950 called The Brave Engineer. The short has run several times on different shows over the years. The basic plot is that Casey is asleep in his engine when he gets the call to deliver mail on time. Running late because of several misadventures, Jones speeds his way to get there, only to have a crash at the finish line, holding the mail in his hand while pieces of its engine roll past him. The House of Mouse did another short inside of the animated package film called Make Mine Music. The short was called Casey at the Bat. While this story is based on a poem about another person, the name of the lead character, Casey Jones, has been linked to the railroad engineer and his love of baseball. They are not connected. There was a classic television show of the Casey Jones story and the steam engine Cannonball Express that ran. Alan Hale Jr., who would also be famous as the skipper on Gilligan's Island, played Casey Jones. Bobby Clark would play Casey Jones Jr. The show aired during the 1957-58 television season. It was loosely based on the pioneering Western Railroad system, with plots centering around Jones and his family, as well as characters in the subplots such as train robbers, bandits, and vandals. The show is in syndication and does run from time to time. The number 638 and Jones would be together until Jones transferred to the Memphis line in February 1900. This train was dubbed the Cannonball Run because it was at that time billed as the fastest schedule in the American history of railroading. Because of the fast pace of the trains, many veteran engineers quit or was transferred because of doubt that the schedules could be met. This is what happened to engineer Willard W. Bill Hatfield. He transferred from Memphis to have another run out of Water Valley. This opened trains number 2 going north and 3 going south. Jones took the opening and moved his family to Memphis to run the trains. The new position gave him a regular high-wheel job, as this would be one link of 4 in a chain with trains running from Chicago, Illinois to New Orleans, Louisiana. He would run the passenger train from Memphis to Canton in 5 hours run time. As the passenger demand got heavier and the trains became longer, the work got harder and more demanding, with the schedules not changing, allowing for more time for the trains to make their destinations. Passenger comfort was not important, and there was no damage suits at that time for being thrown about in the passenger cars. So speed was not adhered to for the schedules to be met. Jones would become associated with this new engine in history, as the engine number 382 came with the job. Engine number 382, also known as Old 382 or Cannonball, was a steam-driven Rogers 460 10-wheeler. The engine had 6 drivers, each about 6 feet high. It was brought new from the Rogers Locomotive Works in 1898, and it was an innovative design and powerful engine of its time. His new and last fireman to work with was Simon T. Sim Webb in 1900. Webb would go on to write the Ballad of Casey Jones as a memorial to his friend that saved his life. There is disagreement about what happened on this night to cause the crash that would go down in history. However, we will discuss all sides and let you make up your mind as to what you believe happened on the night between April 29th and 30th of 1900. To understand this, all of the accounts agree that Casey ran trains number 1 and number 4. Sam Tate ran trains number 2 and number 3 on the Cannonball run. This gave both engineers plenty of time to rest in between their shifts. According to the Railroad Avenue, written by Freeman H. Hubbard, about his interview with Sam Webb, who was Jones' fireman, gives the first account. Engineer Sam Tate was absent from work on his shift as he was marked off as being ill. So Casey Jones volunteered to run his service line, trains number 2 and number 3, to cover for the shift throughout the day. According to Webb, both he and Jones returned to Memphis on the morning of April 29th, which gave them plenty of time to get some sleep. Fred J. Lee, biography of Casey Jones, gives a second account of the accident. He said that Jones and Webb returned to Memphis on the number 4 at 9 p.m. on the evening of the 29th. This deprived both men of much-needed sleep as Casey ran the night shift runs. Jones was then asked to do a turnaround in his shift and run the number 1 that was due out at 11:35 p.m. His regular shift began that night with the number 1 train that was scheduled at 11:35 p.m. with the departure of his service run from Memphis, Tennessee to Canton, Mississippi. Because of the delay in the arrival of the number 1 train, Casey was running 75 minutes late on his nightly run. The train pulled out of Poplar Street Station in Memphis, Tennessee at 12:50 a.m. on the early morning of April 30th, 1900. The train was light that night, only pulling 6 passenger cars, and J.C. Turner was that night's conductor. Jones felt that he could make up his time, though, on the Cannonball engine 382. Jones felt that he had the perfect circumstances to make the record-breaking run. He had a fast engine, a light train, a good fireman, and weather was damp with light rain. However, there was a heavy fog that night, and the run had a lot of tricky curves along the 200-mile journey. The first 100 miles was a run from Memphis, Tennessee to Grenada, Mississippi, with a waypoint stop in Sardis, Mississippi for water. This went uneventful for the crew and the passengers of the Cannonball train that night. Even though this section of railroad had new, light, shaky rails, and he was topping speeds of 80 miles per hour, Jones had managed to make up 55 minutes of his 75-minute delay, even though each stop was for a 15-minute water fill-up for his engine. The next stretch of rails was a 25-mile run from Grenada to Winona, Mississippi. Jones was able to make up an additional 15 minutes from his delayed time in this distance. By the time Jones reached Durant, Mississippi, he was on time. Now running on time while in Durant, Mississippi, Jones receives new orders. He is now to take the siding at Goodman, Mississippi, which was 8 miles south of Durant, and wait for the number 2 passenger train to pass. Then after that he was to continue to Vaughan Railroad Station, which was another 15 miles from there. When he arrived at Vaughan, he would meet the number 26 passenger train, which would be in 2 sections on the side rails. He would then take priority and remain on the main rail. Jones reached Goodman after the number 2 passenger train passed him. He pulled out only 5 minutes behind schedule. Jones felt that he was going to meet his schedule and was making wonderful time, and had 15 miles of fast track in front of him. At the Vaughan Railroad Station, there were 3, not 2 separate trains that were stopped on the rails that night. The first was a double-header freight train. The number 83 engine, which was waiting to be part of the saw-by, was located to the north and headed south, and a long freight train, the number 72 engine, was located to the south and headed north. The 2 trains were on a passing track to the east of the main line. With the combined length of the 2 trains, they were 10 cars longer than the length of the passing track. This caused those cars to be stopped on the main line. Add to this, there were 2 sections of the number 26 on the side track. This was making it difficult for the trains to be moved around in an action called a saw-by. This basically is where trains are moved around in positions where they can pass each other using a second track for assistance. Sometimes cars need to be detached and left on the main rail for a brief time to get this accomplished. On the night of April 30th, 1900, the rail workers were doing a saw-by as quickly as possible at the Vaughan station to make room for Jones and his train to safely pull through the station, when disaster struck. An air hose on the number 72 engine broke in the middle of moving the train and caused the wheels to lock up, leaving the last 4 cars of the number 83 engine on the main line. Jones was still running at a high rate of speed at about 75 miles per hour, and just 2 minutes behind schedule toward the Vaughan station. While approaching the station, there was a 1.5 mile left-hand curve that blocked Jones' view of the station ahead. As they started rounding the curve, Webb could see the red lights of the caboose ahead of them on the main line. He immediately alerted Jones about the danger ahead. Jones had brought down the speed by half, about 40 miles per hour, then told Webb to jump from the train. One account states that when Webb did jump, he fell about 300 feet before he hit the ground and was knocked unconscious. Jones grabbed and blew the train whistle with one hand and the train emergency brake with the other, and held them until the end. Upon impact, the engine went through the first cars. The caboose was filled with hay. The first car after that was filled with corn, and the third car was carrying timber. The engine then derailed and slammed and overturned on an embankment. The baggage and mail cars were severely damaged and also derailed. It is thought that Jones died upon impact, as he was found under the cab. The time on his watch had stopped at 3:52 a.m., the time of impact. It is popular legend that Jones was still holding on to the whistle and the brake when his body was found. Casey's actions saved passengers and railroad men. The express messenger only suffered 2 broken ribs from the accident. Webb and the messenger were the only two other reported injuries. Jones was the only fatality. It is thought that by Jones remaining at his post and applying the brakes until his death, that he saved many lives. The next morning his body was transported to Jackson, Tennessee. His funeral was at St. Mary's Church on May 2nd, 1900. He is buried at Mount Calvary Cemetery in Jackson. On July 13, 1900, the final IC accident report was released by the acting general superintendent of the IC, A.S. Sullivan. John M. Newberry was the flagman on the southbound engine number 83 that Jones hit. He was out that night to warn Jones. However, it is not clear if Jones did not see Newberry because of the fog, the speed of the train, or that Newberry was too far from the tracks to see him clearly, or that Jones had ignored that he was there. However, according to the testimony given at the hearing, Newberry claimed that he had gone out 3,000 feet, about the twice of the height of the Empire State Building, and placed warning torpedoes on the rail. He continued another 500 to 800 feet, where he stood to signal Jones of impending danger. According to the hearings of the official report, Webb did hear the torpedo explode as they neared the Vaughn station. He then walked out to the gangway on the engineer side of the train to see the flagman with the red and white lights beside of the tracks, to which then he looked out of his vantage point from the left side of the train because it was better. It was at this moment that Webb saw the lights from the caboose and warned Jones of the train on the tracks. It was Webb's testimony that Flagman Newberry was not where he said he was, because it would have been impossible to hit the torpedo, then see Newberry if he was where he said he was. It is also highly disputed that Jones would have ignored the flares, torpedoes, and flagmen there to warn him of impending danger ahead. However, the accident report does lay the blame of the accident upon Jones for not heeding the warnings of the flagman. Until the day he died, Webb continued to state that they had no time to stop the train, as Newberry was not in the position that he claimed that he was in. The following injuries were reported. Simon T. Webb, fireman train number 1, body bruises. Mrs. W. E. Bordeaux, passenger, slight bruises. Mrs. W. M. Dido, passenger, slight bruises left knee and left hand. W. M. Miller, express messenger, injuries to back and left side, slight bruising. W. L. Whiteside, postal clerk, jarred. R. A. Ford, postal clerk, jarred. Cost of property damages in 1900. Engine number 382, $1,396.25. Mail car number 51, $610. Baggage car number 217, $105. Caboose number 98119, $430. IC box car 11380, $4,000. IC box car 24116, $55. The total property damage in 1900 was $2,996. An update indicated an additional $327.50 in property damage, another $102.56 in track damage, and $100 for freight, and $125 in wrecking expense. It took about 10 years for the imprint of the engine to leave the embankment where it had stopped. The outline of the headlight, spokes of the wheels, and boiler could be seen very clearly. Handcars were used for people who wanted to ride up to the scene to view the traces that were left. Because the corn was scattered everywhere, it grew for years in the surrounding fields around the wreck. Engine number 382 was brought to the Water Valley shop and rebuilt and put back into service. It ran the exact same run with a new engineer named Harry A. Dad Norton, even though the engine was renumbered several times to 212, 5012, and 2012. Death and misfortune seemed to follow it down the tracks. 0382 was involved in several accidents that took 6 lives. In January 1903, criminals caused the 382 to wreck, causing Engineer Norton's legs to be broken and he was severely scalded. His fireman died of his injuries 3 days later. In the month of September 1905, the 382 turned over in a Memphis South Yards. Because it was moving at a very slow rate of speed, Engineer Norton was uninjured in that accident. January 22, 1912. Engine 382 was involved in an accident that killed 5 railroad men and injured several others. The Seminole Limited No. 3, which had now been numbered to 2012 engine, ran into the rear of a passenger train going 50 miles per hour. The 2012 was standing still, taking on water, when it was struck. Those that were killed were J.T. Harriman, Sr., former president of the Illinois Central, F.O. Melcher, vice president of the Rock Island, E.B. Police, general solicitor, Eldridge E. Wright, attorney, son of the former Secretary of War, Luke E. Wright of Memphis, Payne, engineer of No. 3, Champlain, Illinois. The accident is called the Kinmedy wreck, as it happened near Kinmedy, Illinois. Engineer Stroud was at the wheel. The engine was retired in July 1935 with no further incidences reported. In 1921, engine number 638 was sold to the Mexican government and was still operational during the 1940s. We thank you for watching our videos on Casey Jones. Please like, subscribe, share, and comment below. Thank you.